I was doing a good complaining session at God, and I just felt him speak to me very clearly. And he said, "You're not doing what I told you to do." The question we were answering was, how do we grow our church?
Mm.
But the question I needed to be asking was, how do I reach the city?
Can you tell us about your background leading up to your encounter with Jesus?
I actually came to the Lord at a very young age. I started seeking the Lord at about 8 years old,
Uh,
and just had an incredible sense that God was calling me and speaking to me. By the age of 12, I had given my life to the Lord about 20 times, and it didn't seem to connect at all. My parents were Methodists, and I was in a Methodist Sunday school.
mhm.
And I remember sitting through one of the Methodist Sunday school classes, and I gave a note to my teacher saying, I want to give my life to Jesus. And then, because I'm an introvert and I was shy, I took off and I ran away.
Oh,
And she saw the notes and she chased me. she, she got me back again, and in a hail of tears, I gave my life to the Lord. And that was the beginning of a very interesting journey with the Lord.
and then you went to a seminary.
That was quite a few years later. I got interested in television, actually, and movies. Steven Spielberg was one of my heroes, and I wanted to be a movie maker. I studied video and film technology and began working for a television company here.
Mhm.
During that time, I began to lead a local youth group. While I was doing that, I was headed for the military because we were doing compulsory military service, conscription at that stage. And the Lord just supernaturally called me. Several strangers, total strangers, would walk up to me in the street and say, God's called you and you need to be in seminary. And so the next year, I went off to seminary without a cent, and God provided through that and changed the whole course of my life.
David, you grew up in Apartheid, Africa. So what's the change you see? Is there some remnants of that still in existence?
Yeah, growing up under that, you were very unaware of that as a child. You didn't really analyze that at all. You didn't really understand what was going on. Actually, when I studied television and I walked in and they were editing a news broadcast the one day,
Mm.
and I knew what had happened, and I watched the editing and I thought, this is not telling the truth. I went to research and began to uncover what was happening in the country, but I was 19 already at that stage.
Mm.
And then pretty soon they began to vote for change, and the change came. I don't know if the change was good. I don't know if it actually took us to any better place, but that's a little bit of the history of Africa, I guess.
Right.
So the country is different in the sense of the legalized racism. Obviously, all those laws have been removed.
No.
There's still racial tensions and political parties that try and capitalize on that.
Mm.
But I've been to the US many times. I'm just comparing it with the US right now. But I think that on the street, with the average person, there's probably far less racism here now than I've seen in the US.
No. So in South Africa, there's a lot of ethnic groups, and it's a predominantly a Christian country. How much ethnicity and tribalism and all this gets involved in the church? And does it express itself in syncretism or that sort?
It does. I mean, people begin to assemble with their own. And so we've seen churches where one ethnic group becomes a majority and suddenly the rest leave. And so it takes on a certain nature. And so that does express itself in the church quite a bit. Yeah, syncretism is deep. And so when we talk about South Africa being a Christian nation, it's a very thin veneer of Christianity in many ways.
Mm.
Probably the curse of Africa is Christianity is a mile wide and an inch deep.
Yeah.
And that is true here.
Mm.
The largest church, what they call a church in South Africa, about 20 million people, is called the Zionist Church, and it's deeply syncretistic.
Mm.
To the extent that it's probably a cult more than it is a church.
Yeah.
And so traditional African witchcraft and ancestor worship and all of these things are practiced, and reading the scriptures and worship in a godly way are not. And so it's probably more cultish than anything else. And we have movements going amongst those groups of people, rediscovering God and coming to the Lord.
Mm.
But there's a deep, deep syncretism in much of the Christianity in South Africa.
Mm. David, now tell us your journey from there. You were a pastor of a traditional church. And then how do you shift your paradigm from there on to ministering to urban growing cities?
I was a pastor for 14 years. It took me a long time to realize that that's not really what I'm called to do. But, you grow up in a certain way and you want to serve the Lord, and the only route is pastor. And so that's what you go and become. And it's not a bad thing. I learned a tremendous amount. I think that we work with a lot of missionaries today who just do not understand a lot of the dynamics of leading people
Mhm.
because they've gone through those experiences. And so I think it was a very, very good thing in my training.
Mhm.
But out of seminary, I got involved in missions.
Mhm.
And we began in Bophuthatswana, that was kind of a homeland of South Africa. It's now been incorporated in South Africa. And we began to do missions work and preach in schools and hospitals and prisons and on the street and all that kind of stuff. And then we began to form small groups. At that stage, I don't know if you remember, the Ralph Neighbor trend and the cell church trend was really in. Just before the house church thing became a big thing in South Africa, the cell church thing was big here. We were pursuing that model and began these small groups. While I was doing this on the mission field, I was co-pastoring in a church.
Mhm.
These groups we were planting were actually small groups of that church.
Mhm.
I began to go into quite a bit of tension because the small groups that we were starting, what
Yeah.
we were calling home groups, cell groups, they were in contexts that was drastically different to the main church, ethnically, racially, language-wise, socioeconomically, and distance. They were very far removed from the main church. And so the people that we were reaching just didn't feel comfortable in the church that I was helping pastor.
Yeah.
The elders of the church kind of wanted them to come to church on a Sunday because that was the cell church ideal, right? You got to have a big celebration on a Sunday and then all these small groups. And I began to ask that question, but, are these small groups not churches? And that was not very popular question to ask at the time. The internet was just emerging, and on this very, very slow dial-up connection, I was discovering the emergence of house church and all these things. And I was asking these questions. And really, we kind of lost the battle with the elders. Wherever these small groups were, we tried to plant larger expressions of church.
Yeah.
And so I got involved in that traditional church planting with crusades and tents. And we started 5 of these, and I burnt out. I was just completely burnt out.
Mhm.
The natural organic growth that was happening when it was just these small groups versus all the work that it took to train pastors and try and set up structures, it just wasn't worth it. And so in that period of burnout and questioning, the Lord called us to move, and we moved to Midrand, which is a big city in between Johannesburg and Pretoria.
Yeah.
We lived there for 20 years.
Mhm.
And the Lord began to give me a heart for several things in that time period. One was movements of the gospel, which we began to realize, disciple making movements, small groups, not trying to push them all into church buildings and pulpits. And so that's the one thing we grew a heart for. The other thing we grew a heart for increasingly was the cities of the world. And what would it take to reach the cities of the world? And so those two things began to define our ministry slowly as it moved forward.
So one fine Sunday morning, you didn't want to go to church. You wake up in the morning and told your wife, I don't want to go.
After these churches, we moved to Midrand, and um, we had nothing. We started absolutely with debt on the credit card, and we had no job, nothing. We started in a home, and soon the people that joined us wanted a bigger church. And before we knew it, we were actually chasing this one ideal, but practically and in all reality, we were starting a traditional church.
Mhm.
And I found this growing, and we were in a school hall and then a bigger school hall. If you've ever planted churches and school halls, you know what that means.
Yeah.
That means as the leader, you're the usher and the worship leader and the preacher and the counselor. You're the everything. And so I hit the next crisis in my life. The first one was in the previous place. Now I hit another crisis. And I really woke up one morning and turned to Michelle and said, I have a problem. I don't want to go to church, and I'm the pastor. It was really in that experience. I went that morning, and about 100 people, and I was preaching to them. And while I was talking in my mind, I went up into the sky, and I looked down on Gauteng, which is the emergence of the two cities, 10 million people at that point. And I asked, what would it actually take to reach 10 million people? And I just realized that I was building a church on a different question. The church I was building The question we were answering was, how do we grow our church?
Mm.
But the question I needed to be asking was, how do I reach the city? I drew a path in my mind forward, and I realized the journey we were on would never reach the city.
Mm.
And that was a very big turning point in my life. We actually ended up a year later resigning from that church and beginning to build movements the way we do today.
Next day, you went off in a car journey and visited the city and visited some streets, and God talked to you.
Yeah, I took leave actually the next day and drove about 8 hours from here.
Yeah.
And I was in a bad place. I was angry with God. I was angry with myself. I was frustrated. We parked the car. I got out. I said to my wife, take the bags, put them in the place where we're staying. And I walked into the street, and I just started walking down one street after the other.
Mm.
And I was doing a good complaining session at God. And I think about the third street, I just felt him speak to me very clearly. And it was kind of a rebuke. He said, you're not doing what I told you to do. And I knew what he meant. He meant, I've sent you to the city to start movements. And I'd started this traditional church expression. And I'm not saying that's wrong, by the way, but that's not what he told us to do. And I just stopped in my tracks. And then I said, well, the problem is nobody else in the world is doing what you told me to do.
Yeah.
I realized later I wasn't alone.
Yeah.
And so I went through this real sort of turmoil of obedience, because part of that was financial. We had got to a place of financial stability with this church.
Mm.
And now the Lord was telling me to step back into nothing.
Yeah.
And so this real tension of obedience versus comfort. And we took the route of obedience.
So then you met David Watson, my friend.
Yes, I actually had met him once before. And then a friend of mine called me and said, we've got this guy coming to train, and can you host him? We were so at the end of our finances. We had nothing. I wanted to say no, and the Lord said, say yes. So I said, okay. So I went, fetched him on a shoestring budget, and I took him to training, and I went and did other things. And then I'd fetch him. David and I would sit in our pajamas in the evenings in my lounge, and I began to ask him questions, and the Lord just created a connection there. David was very, very key in helping us for the next 10 years to really figure out what movements look like in Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And we're now in a transition as a ministry of slowly letting go of the work that we've done in Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And focusing completely on the global urban scene.
So what were the lessons that David Watson that made you shift to urban ministry?
Well, they were pretty much countless. So I wasn't shifting to urban at that stage. I was just shifting to movement. There's some things that were already intuitive that I knew about the simplicity of mobilizing ordinary people. The idea of replication, that you don't do it all alone, but you've got to build in a way from the beginning that replicates. Some of those movement principles were very, very key to us in the beginning.
Yeah.
It was only a couple of years later that we really began to push into the urban scene. For the first few years, we were building movements in Southern Africa, about 8 different countries. It was only a bit later that I began to push into the city ministry.
How many cities did you adopt in Africa where you planted a movement?
So initially, we were working in 8 countries.
Uh-huh.
In Southern Africa, 1 or 2 of the islands like Madagascar and the East Coast. And we were working with different leaders in those areas. The next 3 years, basically, we saw 3,500 simple churches start in those countries and South Africa. And then I spent 3 or 4 years in Eurasia, and we began to work with teams there and saw incredible movement there across 16 countries in Eurasia.
Yeah.
And then the next transition was the urban work.
So Eurasia is a big chunk of land. Which countries did you have such as plants?
So we were working with teams in 16 countries.
Mm.
And so that whole sort of Eurasia region, largely Russian speaking.
Okay. When we say cities of the world, what is the quantum of the number of cities we are talking about?
I have no idea. I mean, here's the problem. Nobody has a real definition of city. Everybody has their own definition. Whether you're talking urban, suburban, peri-urban, and everything in between, everyone has their own definition. So the United Nations said, well, we're going to be 70% urban by the year 2050. And define urbanization the way governments do. So when a government says this is a city, they'll call it a city. It's actually pretty difficult to draw a circle around that number and say, hey, this is so many cities. But what we do know is the world has been and is going to continue rapidly urbanizing. And so let's say the United Nations is correct that we're somewhere around 52% urban. And by 2050, we'll be 80% urban. That means if we're working in rural contexts only, then it will be relevant to only 30% of the world's population. And that, unfortunately, is something that I think is largely true. The global mission world is focused still very much on the rural environment. And we haven't thought through the challenges of the urban environment yet. So when I look at city and I talk about movements in cities, what I'm really talking about is high density environments, because people's behavior changes when you push them into high density environments. Social networks change, the way they relate to each other changes. A lot of dynamics change. And those dynamics mean that ministry in those environments is different to the rural, vast open spaces, strong family ties, those kinds of things. So there's a shift in sociology that I'm much more interested in than defining which are cities and which are not. And that shift of sociology is extremely important, because one of the things that changes, for example, is the nature of natural social networks. In a rural environment, natural social networks are traditional families, large extended families living together, vast spaces between them. If you get to a village, then people's commonality is often geography. So they'll know their neighbors, but they won't necessarily know someone on the other side far away. Ethnicity, so they're often the same kind of ethnicity. Language, a similar bloodline. All of these things break down in high density environments. You go to high density environments, you find social isolation, you find the redefinition of social networks, you don't find traditional families. And that becomes very critical to understand if we want to understand how the gospel moves through those environments.
Would you like to say something about affinity groups in the cities as well?
The mission was gone through several phases, right? If I go back with a phase before the one that we are in now, we thought that when Jesus said, go to all nations, ethnic, what he was really saying was nation states. So he was saying, go to India, go to South Africa, go to Somalia, go to England. And then, of course, some very clever people redefined that and said, no, we're actually talking about people groups. And so the whole people group understanding began to emerge. And that was incredibly important for us to understand that the word nation in scripture doesn't necessarily refer to nation states. Again, Jesus is not defining the mission by what governments define the edges to be. And so if you look at the word ethne, it really, in essence, means the way people swarm together in large groups, or herd or flock, very much like a bees, a flock of birds, or a herd of cattle. Any way that people move together in large groups. And so people groups, it's very important because that's how people move together. We were talking earlier about Fulani, and so the Fulani move as a tribe, and the Fulani have a very, very deep cultural heritage, and they have all these things that get passed on from father to son. And whenever I travel with a Fulani, he wants to stop and inspect all the cattle we go past. And it doesn't matter where I am, it's the same, because they have that tribal identity. They move together in a large group, right? But when you move to the urban environment, we begin to see the slow redefinition of that ethne. And that's something we have to understand as the world becomes majority urban. It'll be young people that move for opportunity, to look to the future. As I'm getting older, I don't want to be in a city anymore. I want to move out of the city, but young people move towards the city. And young people will move there without their parents. They'll move there without their families. And so they move there alone. And the first thing we find is social isolation. And they find themselves in a multicultural, diverse environment that begins to challenge a lot of those family beliefs and values that they may have. And they're isolated. So they begin to seek out relationship, but the relationships they form are not around common geography. Very popular in the city, people will know each other on other sides of the city, but they won't know their neighbor. And so geography doesn't become the strongest defining factor. Ethnicity doesn't become the strongest defining factor. You'll find groups of people forming that are from different backgrounds. And sometimes when a large group first moves to a city, they'll hang together. That's why we have Chinatowns and refugee camps and these kinds of things. But over time, the children will begin to integrate. You'll see this integration into the urban culture. And family ties won't define what pulls them together and gets them to connect. what is it that brings people together in the urban environment? We've done a tremendous amount of research on this on every continent. And it really comes down to three things. People redefine these new relationships we call affinities, affinity groups, around common interest. They like the same things. And so they may like chess, they may like a certain sport, they may like doing a certain activity together, they might like the same food. That doesn't necessarily mean traditional food. You'll find people from India going to a Chinese restaurant. You get all kinds of mixes happening in the city over time again. So common interest, common need, people have the same problems. When there's a common problem, people will pull together. In South Africa, crime is very big, and so crime is what pulls people together. And so you go to these communities, and it appears that the community are all sort of linked together because of geography, but it's not true. Usually they're linked together because their children go to the same school. So there's a commonality around the school. And if you've got a couple there that don't have children going to that school, they will often not know anyone in that community, and they'll have friendships outside that community. What that means is traditional affinity is broken down, and these new urban affinities have taken over. So common interest, common need or problem, and then common cause. They're fighting for the same issue. And in cities, you will find these movements around cause all the time. They can be political, they can be about the environment, they can be about bringing change, whatever it is, but there's something that they fight for. And so people come together to fight that fight, to create that change. That largely, in very broad terms, is what defines these new urban affinities. And it's the way people move together in large groups. So it's important to understand these natural social networks and these affinities, because the gospel moves through exactly the same channels as everything else. Good news, bad news, fake news moves through the channels. It's relationships, right? And the gospel follows those same channels. And so you can understand that, you can begin to design a strategy for movements of the gospel to happen in a subsection of the city. But if you're still thinking traditional rural affinity, and you say, well, I want to reach this neighborhood, therefore I want to start something here, and I come under the assumption that because people live together, they actually want to commune together, they actually want to form community. And it's a wrong assumption in the context maybe that I'm targeting, then I'm going to be endlessly frustrated in trying to see movements happen. Because the gospel won't jump from neighbor to neighbor, because people aren't actually that interested in knowing each other. But it will jump naturally to someone else who has a common affinity. The future of the Great Commission is urban. I've worked with churches where they start engaging people that were sitting on the doorstep of the church for 20 years and no one ever actually spoke to them. A disciple is only really a disciple when they make disciples. A church is only really a church when it's planting churches.